Before dawn even touched the hills above Thornbury, Alara Whitfield was on her knees in the frost, scrubbing the flagstones outside the kitchen door of Ashcombe Manor. Her knuckles were raw from the cold water, and her breath came out of her in small white clouds that vanished as quickly as they formed, as though even her breathing was not permitted to linger in that house. She was 19, and she had stopped, a long time ago, expecting anyone to notice the cold on her hands. She had not always scrubbed floors. Her father had been a clergyman, a gentle and hopeless man who had loved his books more wisely than he had loved his accounts, and when he died he left behind more debts than affection, though he had given generously of both. Alara had gone first to a distant aunt, who kept her a year out of duty and then handed her along to Ashcombe, as one might hand along a piece of furniture that no longer suited the room. At Ashcombe she was called a ward, though no one behaved as if she were one. She ate what was left after the family had eaten. She wore gowns that had been let out and taken in so many times that the seams told their own quiet history. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, reminded her daily, in the flat, patient voice of someone repeating a lesson to a slow child, that gratitude was the only wage a girl in her position ought to expect. What none of them knew, not Mrs. Pruitt, not the cook, not Lady Cordelia Ashcombe herself, moving through the drawing room in her fine gray silk, was that Alara could read Latin as easily as she could read English. Her father had taught her before he died. The two of them bent over the same worn book by candlelight, and it was the last true thing he had given her besides his name. In the evenings, when the house had gone quiet and she was permitted, at last, an hour that belonged to no one else, Alara took the estate's tangled ledgers into a corner of the cold pantry and set them right. She found the steward's errors and quietly corrected them. She had done this for 2 years now, and in that time she had saved the household from ruin more than once, though not a soul had thanked her, because not a soul knew. She kept on the sill of the kitchen window a single candle. It was not much, a stub of tallow, rationed like everything else that was hers, but she lit it each night before she slept, in memory of her father, and let it burn as long as it would. It was the one thing in the house that was entirely her own to give. Miles away, in a townhouse he had come to despise for its cold, echoing rooms, Duke Rowan Ashworth of Cravenhall stood before a mirror he did not much care to look into, and made a decision that no gentleman of his rank had ever made before him. He would go to Ashcombe not as a duke, but as a groundsman. He would call himself Rowan Hale, and he would work in the gardens, and he would watch the woman his father's will had promised him before she ever learned there was anything to perform for. He was 28, and colder than his reputation deserved, though the reputation had been earned honestly enough. Years before, he had been engaged to a young woman who had courted him only, it turned out, for the amusement of her friends. She had laughed about him behind gloved hands, called him the frozen duke where she thought he could not hear, and Rowan had heard anyway, because a man in his position always hears such things eventually. Since then, he had trusted no one's affection, least of all any that arrived neatly, with a dowry attached and a smile already arranged. His father's will had betrothed him to the daughter of Ashcombe, a woman he had never met, in a house he had never visited. He did not want the marriage, but he wanted the truth of her even less than he wanted the marriage. He wanted, before anything else was decided, to know what kind of person she was when she believed no duke was watching. "I am told the roads to Thornbury are poor this season," his valet said, packing the plain coat and the plainer boots. "Then I shall be glad of poor roads," Rowan said. "A man arriving on foot asks fewer questions of himself." The secret waiting for him at Ashcombe was larger and crueler than he could have imagined. The young woman he had been promised, Verity Ashcombe, had died of a fever 2 winters before, quietly, without pain, in the small hours of a January night. Her stepmother, Lady Cordelia, had told no one outside the house. She had gone on writing to the Cravenhall solicitors as though Verity still sat by the window each evening, embroidering nothing in particular, waiting for a husband she would never meet. The dowry payments had continued to arrive. Lady Cordelia's own jointure had been mismanaged for years by a husband now 3 years in his grave, and her daughter's futures depended entirely on money that was, in the strictest sense, no longer owed to anyone. Lady Cordelia was not a brutish woman. Her cruelty wore silk and spoke softly. She had noticed, as anyone in that house eventually noticed, that Alara bore a passing resemblance to the dead Verity. The same fair hair, the same quiet bearing. And a plan had begun to take shape in her mind long before the Duke's arrival could no longer be postponed. When the day came, she would dress the girl in Verity's old gowns and present her as the bride. If Alara refused, Lady Cordelia had already decided what she would say: that a girl turned out into the winter roads without a character reference did not go far and did not go warm. "You will do this," Lady Cordelia told her one gray afternoon, examining a bolt of ivory silk laid across the settee, "because you have nowhere else to be, and because I have been, on the whole, generous to you." Alara said nothing. She had learned in her years at Ashcombe that silence cost her less than argument. It was into this house, 3 weeks before the dinner, Lady Cordelia dreaded and planned for an equal measure, that a man calling himself Rowan Hale arrived to rake the leaves and mend the garden walls. He noticed Alara on his second day. She was carrying her own bread ration, thin, hard, the kind of bread that was baked for people no one expected to complain, across the yard toward the stables, where a boy of perhaps 10 sat shivering in the tack room, too weak with hunger to do more than stare at the ground. Alara knelt and put the bread in his hands and told him, in a voice too low for anyone but the boy and the man raking leaves 20 feet away to hear, that he was to eat it slowly and that she was not hungry herself, which was not true. Rowan Hale straightened over his rake and did not go back to work for a long moment. He had come to Ashcombe expecting to find a bride grasping for a title, or indifferent to one, or simply ordinary in the way that most young women of good family were ordinary, pleasant, accomplished, waiting. He had not expected to find a girl giving away her own bread in a stable yard where she believed no one of consequence was watching. He found reasons, in the days that followed, to be wherever she was. He mended the fence nearest the kitchen garden, where she went each morning for herbs. He was, by unhappy coincidence, that he arranged with some care, always crossing the same corridor when she carried linens or trays. He did not speak to her more than the barest civility required, because a groundsman did not address a lady's companion beyond what courtesy demanded, and because he was, in truth, afraid of what he might say if he allowed himself more. What he saw over those weeks undid him slowly and completely. He saw her endure Mrs. Pruitt's scorn without ever once answering it in kind. He saw her mend a torn hem for one of the younger housemaids without being asked, and refuse the girl's thanks as though thanks were an embarrassment rather than a debt owed. He saw her, late one evening, when he had lingered near the study on some invented errand, bent over the estate ledgers with a candle stub burning low beside her, correcting figures in a small, careful hand, murmuring numbers to herself in a Latin phrase her father must have taught her as a child, a habit, he would learn later, that helped her keep her place in a long column of sums. He had not known, until he watched her do it, that competence could look like tenderness. "You work very late, Miss Whitfield," he said one night, forgetting himself enough to speak, though he stood carefully in the doorway and did not come further in. She startled, closed the ledger, and for a moment he thought she would apologize, the way servants were trained to apologize for existing in rooms they had every right to occupy. Instead, she said simply, "Someone must," and went back to her figures, and he understood that she had not been looking for permission from him or from anyone. He began to think, against every resolution he had made in that cold townhouse mirror, that he had been wrong to believe kindness could not survive being unwatched. He had built his whole plan on the theory that people showed their truest selves only when they believed themselves unobserved by anyone who mattered. He had not accounted for the possibility that a person's truest self might simply be good, with no audience required at all. Alara, for her part, began, despite every hard lesson Ashcombe had taught her, to trust the quiet groundsman who never once looked through her the way the rest of the household did. He asked her small questions and waited for the answers. He noticed when she was tired. Once, finding her carrying water she should not have had to carry alone, he took the pail from her hands without asking and without comment, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world for a groundsman to lighten a servant's burden, and she had gone back to her room that night and sat a long while by her candle, turning over the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being seen. Neither of them said what was happening between them, because neither of them quite believed it was permitted to happen at all. The dramatic weight of it pressed on every small exchange, a bucket handed over, a question answered honestly, a shared silence in a cold hallway. because she trusted a man she believed to be nothing, and he was in fact the very duke she was being prepared, against her will, to deceive. Lady Cordelia noticed none of this. She had never in her life thought it worth her attention to notice a groundsman. The dinner she had been dreading arrived at last on a night sharp with frost, the same kind of frost that had been on the flagstones the morning Alara first scrubbed them. Lady Cordelia had sent for the ivory silk gown that had once belonged to Verity, and that afternoon, in a small dressing room with the door firmly shut, she informed Alara of what was expected of her. "You will wear this," Lady Cordelia said, "and you will answer to the name Verity Ashcombe, and you will smile at whatever the Duke says to you, and you will not under any circumstance correct him." Her voice was pleasant, almost kind, the way a voice can be pleasant while delivering a threat. "If you cannot manage this small thing, I am afraid I cannot manage to keep you. A girl without a character reference finds the roads very long in winter, Miss Whitfield. I have seen it happen to girls far more clever than you." Alara stood very still while the gown was laced around her, feeling the cold silk settle over her shoulders like a second, colder skin. She thought of the candle on her windowsill, burning low, and wondered whether anyone would notice if it went out for good. She did not beg. She did not weep in front of Lady Cordelia, though she came close, later, alone, before she caught herself and set her face back into the careful stillness that had kept her safe for 2 years. When at last she was led down to the drawing room where the household had assembled to receive the Duke, she walked with her chin level and her hands folded, because whatever happened next, she had decided, would not happen to a woman who had begged for it. The room was full of candlelight and Lady Cordelia's brittle good humor. Alara was presented gently, cruelly, as Miss Verity Ashcombe, and she felt every eye in the room settle on her. The cooks, the housemaids, Mrs. Pruitts, all of them complicit in a silence that could ruin her the moment it broke. She looked for the one face in the room that had ever looked at her plainly, and found, standing near the door in a groundsman's plain coat, the man she knew as Rowan Hale. He was watching her too, but something in his stillness had changed. He crossed the room slowly, and the household went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when it senses, before it understands, that something enormous is about to occur. He stopped before Alara, and he did not speak to her first. He turned instead to Lady Cordelia, and he removed his glove. Beneath it, on his smallest finger, was a signet ring Alara had never once noticed, because a groundsman had no reason to wear such a thing, and because he had kept it hidden there for exactly this purpose. "I believe," he said, in a voice that was not the careful, unremarkable voice of a hired man, "there has been a considerable misunderstanding in this house, and I intend to correct it tonight." He told them, plainly and without raising his voice, who he was. He told them that he had spent the past weeks not as a groundsman waiting for wages, but as a duke waiting for the truth, and that in that time he had learned a great deal about the household of Ashcombe, more perhaps than Lady Cordelia would have wished any duke to learn. He laid before her, on the small table where her fan had rested a moment before, letters he had quietly gathered, correspondence with the Cravenhall solicitors, written long after Verity Ashcombe had already been laid to rest, each one composed to keep a dowry flowing into a house that no longer had a bride to offer for it. Lady Cordelia's face, for the first time in the 2 years Alara had known her, lost all its careful arrangement. "Your Grace," she began, and found she had nothing true to follow it with. "You have a choice before you," Rowan said, and his voice, though quiet, filled the whole room. "I can lay this matter before a magistrate, and you may explain to him what you have explained to no one else. Or you may leave this house quietly tonight for a smaller one and trouble no one further with schemes that were never yours to attempt." It was Alara, still in the dead girl's gown, still trembling, though no one in the room could have said from what, who spoke into the silence that followed. "Let her go quietly," she said. "Her daughters have done nothing. Let them keep what little is left to them." Lady Cordelia looked at her with an expression Alara could not name. Not gratitude, not quite, but something close enough to it that it left her, for once, without a single clever thing to say. She chose the cottage. Her power over the household, which had seemed for 2 years as fixed and permanent as the walls themselves, dissolved that night into nothing more than an old woman gathering what belongings she could carry and a smaller house waiting somewhere down a colder road. Rowan turned back to Alara once the room had begun, slowly, to breathe again. "I did not come here to deceive you," he said, quietly enough now that it was meant for her alone. "I came to find out who you were before you had any reason to perform for me. And what I found was a woman who gave away her own bread to a boy she barely knew, and mended ledgers no one asked her to mend, and never once, in all the cruelty this house showed her, became cruel in return." He paused. "I do not know how to ask forgiveness for the manner of it. I only know that I watched you when you did not know it, and it was the making of me." Alara looked at him for a long moment, still in another dead woman's gown, still uncertain whether the ground beneath her had become solid or had simply changed the shape of its danger. But his face held none of the practiced charm she had learned to distrust in gentlemen, and none of Lady Cordelia's careful arrangement. It held only the plain, unguarded look of a man who had told her at last the whole truth at once. "Then I am glad," she said slowly, "that it was only a groundsman I trusted, Your Grace. I should not have known how to trust a duke." "You did trust a duke," he said. "You simply did not know his rank yet. I am hoping in time that will matter to you a good deal less than the rest of it did." The spring that followed brought Alara to Cravenhall not as a servant, not as a substitute for a dead woman in a borrowed gown, but as herself, married in a small ceremony she had chosen the shape of entirely on her own. She wore no one's silk but her own. The estate at Cravenhall was, in its own quiet way, as neglected in its accounts as Ashcombe had been, and Alara, now Duchess of Cravenhall, set about correcting it with the same patient hand she had once used in a cold pantry by candlelight, except now she did the work in daylight at a desk that was hers, with no one to hide the work from. She kept still a light in her window. It was no longer a rationed stub of tallow guttering on borrowed wax. It was a great brass lamp, always kept burning in the window of her private study, so that any servant working late in the house below might look up and see it and know that the mistress of Cravenhall remembered exactly what it was to be cold and rationed and unseen. On the mantel beside that lamp sat a single framed letter, the first one Rowan had ever written her under his own true name, sent the week after Lady Cordelia's departure, before either of them had spoken of marriage at all. Alara read it most evenings, though she had long since known every word of it by heart, because there is a particular comfort in returning, again and again, to the moment one first understood that one was, at last, truly seen. It ended with the line that had undone her the first time she read it, and undid her still gently each time she read it again. "I watched you when you did not know it, and it was the making of me." The stable boy from Ashcombe, grown a little taller and a good deal sturdier, came to Cravenhall the following year as an undergroom, on Alara's own quiet insistence, and no one in that house was ever again given a bread ration too thin to notice. Mrs. Pruitt's name was never spoken again beneath that roof, and Lady Cordelia's cottage stood, small and unremarkable, at the far edge of a county neither Alara nor Rowan had any further reason to visit. In the evenings, when the work of the day was finished and the house had gone quiet in the particular peaceful way houses go quiet when nothing in them is afraid, Rowan would find his wife at her desk, lamp burning steadily beside her, and would stand a moment in the doorway simply watching her the way he once had, long ago, from behind a rake in a garden that was never really his to tend. She always felt him there before he spoke. She always looked up and smiled, because there was, at last, nothing in that look for her to fear. "Still working," he said once, echoing without quite meaning to, the very first thing he had ever said to her. "Someone must," she said, exactly as she had the first time, and closed the ledger and let him take her hand. "Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories."